Hello, students. This lesson was designed for those looking to advance their English listening skills to the academic level and for those interested in learning about psychology at the university level. This lesson covers Chapter 2 of 16 and is part of our comprehensive audio course adapted from the textbook Psychology 2E. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified as each new chapter is released, and for future videos to advance your English language skills. Let's get started. Chapter 2. Psychological Research. Have you ever stopped to think about whether the violence you see on television influences the way you behave? Does watching dramatic scenes of aggression on screen make you more likely to act aggressively in real life? Or could it actually have the opposite effect, helping you release those feelings and become more peaceful? And what about children? How does the media they consume shape their thoughts and actions? These are the kinds of questions that psychologists explore when studying the relationship between behavior and exposure to violent imagery. Concerns about how new technologies shape human behavior aren't new. Even in ancient times, people worried about how innovations might affect their thinking. The philosopher Socrates, for example, feared that writing, considered a groundbreaking technology back then, would weaken people's ability to remember things because they could rely on written records instead of their own memory. Today, with rapid advancements in technology, similar concerns continue to emerge. Beyond screen time on phones, computers, and gaming devices, technology is also transforming our cars, homes, and daily routines, from GPS navigation to virtual assistants and smart security systems. With these innovations woven into our everyday lives, debates about their benefits and drawbacks are inevitable. Some people embrace these changes, while others are deeply skeptical. So, how do we move beyond opinion and find solid answers to these questions? This is where psychological research plays a crucial role. By relying on evidence rather than speculation, it helps us better understand the effects of technology on human behavior and decision-making. Scientific research is one of the most powerful tools we have for making sense of our complex world. Without it, we'd have to rely purely on intuition, authority, or even luck to guide our decisions. While we often feel confident in our ability to interpret and understand the world around us, history has shown just how mistaken we can be when we overlook the importance of evidence. At different points in time, people were convinced that the sun revolved around a flat earth, that continents were fixed in place, and that mental illness was caused by supernatural possession. It was only through systematic scientific research that these misconceptions were challenged and replaced with more accurate understandings of reality. The goal of all scientists is to deepen our knowledge of the world, and psychologists focus on one of the most fascinating aspects: human behavior. They study not only how people act, but also the mental and physiological processes that drive those actions. Unlike personal experience or intuition, scientific research relies on evidence that can be repeatedly observed and tested. This is what makes scientific knowledge empirical. It's based on concrete, measurable data rather than subjective beliefs. But while behavior is something we can directly observe, the mind itself is not. Imagine seeing someone crying. You can witness the action, but the reason behind it isn't immediately clear. Are they crying out of sadness, pain, joy? Sometimes, simply asking can provide an answer. But in many cases, people might not be able or willing to explain their emotions. An infant, for example, cannot tell us why they are crying. In such situations, psychologists have to develop creative methods to uncover the underlying causes of behavior. Understanding how scientific research is conducted is essential, not just for psychology, but for making informed decisions in all areas of life. This chapter will explore how scientific knowledge is generated and why it plays such a crucial role in shaping both our personal choices and broader public policies. Determining which theories are widely accepted by the scientific community isn't always straightforward, especially in a broad and evolving field like psychology. Today, we have more access to information than ever before, and a quick internet search on almost any research topic will likely reveal conflicting findings. This isn't necessarily a problem. It's a sign that the scientific community is in the process of evaluating evidence and working toward a consensus, which can take time. Take, for example, the ongoing debate about how technology affects learning. Over the past few decades, technology has become a major part of education, but researchers have yet to reach a definitive conclusion on whether it ultimately helps or hinders students. Some studies suggest that certain technologies, like smartphone apps designed for medical students, can increase engagement and improve test scores. On the other hand, research on undergraduate students has found that excessive technology use can negatively impact sleep, communication, and time management. With so many variables at play, it's clear that more research is needed before we can fully understand the effects of technology on students' learning and well-being. While research continues, it's important to think critically about the information we encounter. A healthy dose of skepticism is necessary when evaluating claims, especially those that are widely promoted online or in advertising. When presented with a claim, consider the source. What is the expertise of the person making the claim? Do they have something to gain if their claim is accepted? Does the evidence truly support their conclusion? And what do other experts in the field have to say? These questions help us separate legitimate scientific findings from opinions, marketing tactics, or misinformation. Being an informed consumer of information is especially important when making decisions with real-world consequences, such as those in politics and public policy. Imagine you've just been elected governor of your state. One of your responsibilities is managing the state budget and deciding whether to continue funding early intervention programs designed to support young children from disadvantaged backgrounds by providing services that help with development and long-term success. While these programs sound beneficial, you'd want to ensure they are actually effective before committing taxpayer money to them. Fortunately, research in psychology and related fields has provided extensive evidence that many of these programs do have positive effects. Some are more effective than others, and their long-term benefits vary. But overall, the data suggests they contribute to better outcomes for children. As a responsible decision-maker, you wouldn't rely on intuition or personal opinion alone. Instead, you would examine the research. Which programs work best? What makes them successful? What kind of impact do they have over time? By turning to scientific evidence, you'd be in the best position to make an informed choice, one that benefits both the individuals involved and society as a whole. Using research to guide decision-making isn't just important for politicians, it's something we all do, whether we realize it or not. At some point, each of us will likely turn to research to help navigate a difficult choice. imagine your sister, Maria, is worried about her 2-year-old son, Umberto. Compared to other children in his daycare and family, Umberto doesn't speak as much or as clearly. Concerned, Maria takes him to the pediatrician, who performs a screening and suggests an evaluation with a speech pathologist. However, the doctor doesn't seem alarmed and doesn't refer Maria to any other specialists. Maria, on the other hand, wonders if Umberto's speech delay could be a sign of a developmental disorder. The doctor has a different perspective. She believes Umberto's speech differences could be related to his jaw and facial muscles. Wanting to help, you turn to the internet for answers, only to find yourself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. Some sources are blog posts and opinion pieces. Others are promotional materials from healthcare providers. And there are even lists of so-called expert tips promising quick answers. Mixed in with all of this are recommendations from advocacy organizations, each offering different perspectives. But how do you determine which sources are truly based on research and which are simply personal opinions or marketing? This is where the distinction between facts and opinions becomes essential. Facts are observable realities, things that can be measured and verified. Opinions, on the other hand, are personal judgments or beliefs that may or may not be accurate. In the scientific community, facts aren't just declared. They must be supported by evidence gathered through systematic, empirical research. This process ensures that conclusions are based on real data rather than assumptions or subjective viewpoints. When facing important decisions, whether in politics, healthcare, education, or our personal lives, it's crucial to rely on credible research. Understanding the difference between well-supported findings and unverified claims helps us make informed choices, ensuring that we act based on knowledge rather than speculation. Psychological research has been shaped by the contributions of many remarkable individuals from diverse backgrounds. While some of the early pioneers were introduced in the first chapter, there are many more whose work has played a crucial role in advancing psychology as a science. One of these trailblazers was Margaret Floy Washburn, who became the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology in 1894. Her research focused on animal behavior and cognition, laying the groundwork for later studies in comparative psychology. Around the same time, Mary Whiten Calkins emerged as a leading psychologist, known for her opposition to the behaviorist movement and her influential work on memory. She also made history by establishing one of the earliest experimental psychology labs in the United States. Psychology's progress was also shaped by individuals who broke racial barriers in the field. In 1920, Francis Sumner became the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology. His research addressed psychoanalysis, racial bias, and educational justice, and he later co-founded the psychology department at Howard University. Because of his pioneering work, he's often called the father of Black psychology. A little over a decade later, Inez Beverly Prosser became the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in psychology. Her research examined the effects of segregation on Black students, and her findings played a key role in influencing the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision, which declared school segregation unconstitutional. While psychology's scientific foundations were initially established in Europe and the United States, it didn't take long for researchers around the world to develop their own programs and laboratories. In Argentina, Horacio Pinheiro founded some of the earliest experimental psychology labs in South America. In India, Gunamudian, David Boaz, and Narendra Nath Sengupta established the first independent psychology departments at the University of Madras and the University of Calcutta, respectively, creating new opportunities for Indian researchers to contribute to the field. In the early years of the American Psychological Association, founded in 1892, all of its members were white men. However, by 1905, Mary Whiten Calkins was elected as the APA's first female president. By 1946, nearly a quarter of American psychologists were women, and psychology had become a popular degree choice for students at, historically, black colleges and universities. Today, as higher education continues to become more accessible to historically underrepresented groups, psychology is becoming an increasingly diverse field. This growing diversity offers hope that the future of psychological research will better reflect the experiences and needs of all people, ultimately leading to a broader and more inclusive understanding of human behavior. Scientific knowledge doesn't develop randomly. It follows a structured process known as the scientific method. This method allows researchers to test ideas and refine them based on real-world evidence. At its core, it's a continuous cycle. Theories and hypotheses are tested through empirical observations, and those observations, in turn, generate new ideas that lead to further testing. This ongoing process is what drives scientific progress. Within this cycle, two key types of reasoning come into play: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a general idea or theory and tests it in the real world. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, works in the opposite direction. It begins with real-world observations, which then lead to the development of new ideas and theories. These two processes are inseparable, much like breathing in and out. While both are essential to research, different approaches may emphasize one more than the other, depending on the goals of the study. Understanding this dynamic is important because it explains how scientific knowledge is built over time. By continuously testing, observing, and refining ideas, researchers ensure that their conclusions are based on solid evidence rather than assumptions. In scientific research, deductive reasoning starts with a general idea, a hypothesis, and applies it to specific situations to draw logical conclusions. If the hypothesis is correct, then any conclusions reached through deductive reasoning should also be correct. For example, let's say the hypothesis is that all living things require energy to survive. Ducks are living things. So based on deductive reasoning, we conclude that ducks require energy to survive. Since the hypothesis is correct, the conclusion is also correct. However, deductive reasoning can sometimes lead to incorrect conclusions if the initial hypothesis is flawed. Imagine someone assumes that all ducks are born with the ability to see. If we apply this logic to a specific duck, let's say quackers, we would conclude that quackers was born with the ability to see. But what if quackers was born blind? This example shows why scientists don't just rely on logical reasoning alone. They must test their hypotheses through empirical research to confirm their accuracy. While deductive reasoning starts with a broad generalization and applies it to specific cases, inductive reasoning works in the opposite direction. It begins with real-world observations and uses them to form broader generalizations. However, Inductive conclusions aren't always accurate, even if they seem logical. For example, if someone notices that their favorite fruits, apples, bananas, and oranges, all grow on trees, they might assume that all fruits must grow on trees. But, of course, strawberries, blueberries, and kiwis prove otherwise. Scientists use both inductive and deductive reasoning in their work. Inductive reasoning helps generate theories by identifying patterns from observations, while deductive reasoning allows researchers to test specific hypotheses derived from those theories. Different types of research emphasize one type of reasoning more than the other. Hey everyone, I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you about our Patreon. By joining the Walker Higher Education Patreon, you can support the channel, get exclusive access to download any of my video lessons, get early releases of upcoming content, and even vote to choose what content I'll make next. Your support helps me to keep creating high-quality learning resources to help you succeed. So, if you found my videos helpful, consider joining today. I truly appreciate it. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. Case studies, for instance, rely heavily on inductive reasoning. Researchers collect vast amounts of data and look for meaningful patterns that could lead to new insights. On the other hand, experimental research is primarily based on deductive reasoning, where scientists test hypotheses in controlled settings to determine cause and effect relationships. Now, what exactly do we mean when we talk about theories and hypotheses? A theory is a well-developed explanation for a set of observed phenomena. It's a broad framework that helps make sense of the world. But because theories are often too complex to be tested all at once, researchers break them down into hypotheses, specific, testable predictions. A hypothesis acts as a bridge between ideas and real-world observations. It is often structured as an if-then statement, such as, if I study all night, I will pass my test. By testing hypotheses through empirical research, scientists refine theories, ensuring that scientific knowledge remains accurate, reliable, and ever-evolving. To understand how the scientific process works in psychology, let's look at a specific theory and how it generates testable hypotheses. One well-known theory of emotion is the James Lange theory, which suggests that our emotions are directly tied to physiological responses in the body. According to this theory, we don't feel fear first and then experience physical reactions. Rather, our body reacts first, and those physical changes create the feeling of fear. Imagine walking out of your home and encountering an aggressive snake right on your doorstep. Your heart starts pounding, your stomach churns, and your muscles tense. According to the James Lange theory, these bodily reactions cause your emotional experience of fear. From this theory, researchers can develop a testable hypothesis. One possible hypothesis might be, if a person is unaware of their physiological arousal in response to a snake, they will not experience fear. This is a specific prediction that can be tested through research, which is an essential part of the scientific process. But what makes a hypothesis scientific? One key feature is that it must be falsifiable, meaning that there must be a way to prove it wrong if it is incorrect. A good scientific hypothesis isn't just an idea. It has to be something that can be tested through observation and experimentation. This is where some psychological theories, such as those proposed by Sigmund Freud, face criticism. Freud introduced many influential ideas about human personality and behavior, including the concepts of the ID, ego, and superego, three components he believed shaped a person's thoughts and actions. However, a major issue with Freud's theories is that they are not falsifiable. There is no clear way to design an experiment that could disprove the existence of the ID, ego, or superego. Because of this, Freud's ideas do not fit neatly into the framework of scientific psychology. That said, Freud's contributions remain historically significant. His theories laid the foundation for personality psychology and psychotherapy, and many of his ideas have influenced modern therapeutic approaches. While his work may not be testable in the way that modern psychological research demands, it continues to be studied because of its impact on the field. By distinguishing between testable scientific theories and those that are not falsifiable, psychology continues to evolve as a discipline, ensuring that the knowledge we rely on is grounded in evidence and capable of withstanding rigorous testing. Unlike theories that cannot be tested, the James Lange theory of emotion generates falsifiable hypotheses, meaning that researchers can design studies to determine whether its claims hold up under scientific scrutiny. Take, for example, the hypothesis we discussed earlier. If a person cannot detect physiological changes in their body, they will not experience emotion. This hypothesis can be tested by studying individuals who have suffered significant spinal cord injuries, people who may have lost the ability to sense the physical reactions that often accompany emotional states. If the James Lange theory is entirely correct, these individuals should not experience emotions in the same way as those who can still feel physiological arousal. In fact, research has been conducted on this very question. The findings suggest that while people with limited awareness of their body's physiological changes may experience emotions with less intensity, they still feel emotions. This suggests that while bodily sensations play a role in emotional experience, they are not the only factor at play. This is the power of falsifiability in scientific research. A hypothesis that can be tested and potentially disproven allows scientists to refine their understanding over time. The scientific process demands repeated testing, and only after multiple studies confirm a finding does it become widely accepted by the scientific community. This rigorous approach is what gives us confidence in the reliability of scientific knowledge, ensuring that the conclusions we draw are based on evidence rather than speculation. Psychologists have a variety of research methods at their disposal to help them understand, describe, and explain behavior, as well as the cognitive and biological processes that drive it. Some methods rely solely on observation, while others involve direct interaction with participants, ranging from simple questionnaires to in-depth interviews or tightly controlled experiments. Each research method has its own strengths and limitations, and the choice of method depends on the research question being investigated. Observational studies, for instance, generate rich, detailed information, but because they typically rely on small sample sizes, their findings may not be easily applied to the broader population. Surveys, on the other hand, allow researchers to collect data from larger groups of people, making it easier to generalize findings. However, surveys also come with drawbacks. They provide limited depth of information and depend on self-reported data, which can sometimes be inaccurate. Another research approach is archival research, which involves analyzing existing records rather than gathering new data. This method is cost-effective and can provide valuable insights, But researchers have no control over how the original data was collected or what variables were recorded, which can limit its usefulness. All of these methods, observation, surveys, and archival research, are correlational in nature. They can reveal relationships between variables, showing how different factors may be associated with each other. However, correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things appear to be related doesn't mean that one causes the other. The only way to establish a cause and effect relationship is through experimental research. In experiments, researchers control and manipulate variables to determine their impact. This level of control makes experiments a powerful tool for uncovering causal relationships. However, there are some trade-offs. Experiments are often conducted in highly controlled, artificial settings, which raises questions about whether the results truly reflect what happens in real-world situations. Additionally, some psychological questions simply cannot be studied experimentally due to ethical concerns. Researchers must always consider the well-being of participants when designing their studies. Each research method plays an important role in psychological science, and understanding their strengths and limitations helps researchers choose the best approach for answering different types of questions. In 2011, the New York Times featured a remarkable story about Krista and Tatiana Hogan, conjoined twins from Canada who are connected at the head. What makes their case particularly fascinating is that they may be connected through a part of the brain called the thalamus, a major sensory relay center that processes incoming sensory information before sending it to higher brain regions. If this is true, it means that one twin might actually experience the sensations of the other. For example, if Krista is watching a funny television show, Tatiana might laugh, even if she isn't watching the program herself. This possibility has captured the interest of neuroscientists who study how the brain processes sensory experiences. Since their condition is extremely rare, these twins provide a unique opportunity for scientific research. As long as their family continues to give permission, scientists are likely to follow their development closely, gathering valuable insights into brain function. Over time, research has shown that while Krista and Tatiana do share some sensory and motor experiences, they remain two distinct individuals. Their case offers a rare window into the relationship between the brain and the mind, helping scientists understand how sensory information is processed and integrated. This kind of observational research is known as a clinical or case study, a method in which scientists focus on one person or a small group of individuals. Some researchers dedicate their entire careers to studying just 10 to 20 people. And there's a good reason for this. Studying a small number of individuals allows for an incredibly deep level of insight that no other research method can provide. Case studies allow scientists to gather rich, detailed information about unique cases, leading to discoveries that might not be possible through larger-scale studies. But if case studies provide so much valuable information, why aren't they used more frequently? The biggest strength of case studies is also their greatest limitation. Since they often focus on rare or unusual individuals, their findings may not apply to the broader population. Scientists aim to understand universal human behavior, but case studies involve people who are different from the average person, making it difficult to generalize the results. Generalization refers to the ability to apply research findings to a wider group of people, while case studies provide in-depth knowledge. Their findings may not translate to how most people experience the world. Despite this limitation, case studies remain an essential part of psychological research, especially when studying rare conditions or extraordinary individuals. They offer a level of detail and depth that no other method can, making them a powerful tool for uncovering new and groundbreaking insights into human behavior and brain function. If we want to truly understand behavior, one of the most effective ways to gather information is to observe it in its natural setting. But here's the challenge. People often change their behavior when they know they're being watched. So, how can researchers study behavior accurately without influencing it? Imagine your professor asks the class, "Raise your hand if you always wash your hands after using the restroom." Almost every hand in the room will go up. But is this really true? Do people actually wash their hands every single time? Chances are, some people may be responding in a way that they think is expected, rather than truthfully. This tendency to alter behavior when being observed is a challenge in research. This issue isn't unique to human studies. Naturalistic observation is widely used to study animals in their environments as well. Researchers carefully observe species ranging from ground squirrels to gorillas without interfering, allowing them to document natural behaviors like social hierarchies, communication, and group dynamics. One of the most famous examples of this kind of research comes from Jane Goodall, who spent nearly 5 decades observing chimpanzees in Africa. However, her work was not without controversy. Some scientists criticized her for giving the chimpanzees names instead of numbers, arguing that this emotional connection could undermine the objectivity of the study. So, if we wanted to accurately study something like hand-washing behavior, what could we do? Instead of asking people directly, we might take a different approach. Naturalistic observation. Suppose we send a classmate into the restroom to discreetly observe whether people actually wash their hands. Of course, our observer wouldn't stand in a lab coat with a clipboard, staring at the sinks. That would immediately influence behavior. Instead, they might pretend to adjust their contact lenses while secretly noting people's actions. A similar approach was used by Suzanne Fanger and her colleagues when studying peer exclusion on playgrounds. Instead of standing nearby with notebooks, they equipped a few preschoolers with wireless microphones. Since the children quickly forgot they were wearing them, their behavior remained natural. Additionally, the study was conducted at a laboratory preschool where children were already used to the presence of observers. This method allowed researchers to gather genuine data on how children interact and exclude peers. The key to successful naturalistic observation is that the observer must remain as inconspicuous as possible. If people realize they're being watched, their behavior changes. A simple example of this is driving behavior. Imagine driving down a quiet highway in the middle of the day. Chances are you're relaxed and driving at your own pace. Now, imagine that a police car is following you down that same highway. Suddenly, you're much more conscious of your speed, your signals, and every move you make. That's the power of observation. It influences behavior, whether we realize it or not. Naturalistic observation allows researchers to capture authentic behaviors in real-world settings, making it a valuable method for studying everything from social interactions to personal habits. However, ensuring that observations remain unobtrusive is crucial. Otherwise, the data collected may not reflect what truly happens when no one is watching. One of the biggest advantages of naturalistic observation is that it provides valid, accurate information about behavior as it naturally occurs. Since individuals behave as they normally would in a real-world situation, this research method offers high ecological validity, meaning that the findings are more realistic and applicable to everyday life. If the observation is done correctly, researchers don't have to worry about people or animals changing their behavior simply because they're being watched. Many people assume that reality TV shows provide a window into authentic human behavior. But is that really the case? Not exactly. Reality show participants are followed by camera crews, placed in artificial settings, and interviewed for on-camera confessionals, all of which violate the principle of inconspicuous observation. In an environment like that, it's hard to believe that people are acting the same way they would in real life. However, while naturalistic observation provides realistic data, it also comes with challenges. One major drawback is that these studies can be difficult to set up and control. Let's go back to the hand-washing study we discussed earlier. Imagine standing in a restroom all day, ready to record behavior, only to find that no one comes in. Or think about researchers observing a troop of gorillas in the wild for weeks, only to wake up one morning and realize the gorillas migrated overnight to a new location. The unpredictability of natural settings means that researchers often need a significant investment of time, resources, and patience, and sometimes a little luck. Because of these challenges, some researchers use structured observation, which involves observing people in a controlled setting while they perform specific tasks. A classic example of this is Mary Ainsworth's strange situation experiment, which examined attachment styles between infants and caregivers. In this study, caregivers brought their infants into a room filled with toys. The procedure involved several key phases. A stranger enters the room, the caregiver leaves, and then the caregiver returns. By closely observing the infant's behavior, especially their reaction when reunited with the caregiver, researchers could classify attachment styles and gain insight into early emotional development. Another challenge in observational research is observer bias. Researchers who are deeply involved in a project may unintentionally skew their observations to align with their expectations. To minimize this bias, it's important to establish clear criteria for recording behaviors and ensure that all observations are classified consistently. A common method used to check for accuracy is inter-rater reliability, where multiple observers record the same event and compare their findings. If different researchers agree on what they observed, the data is considered more reliable and less influenced by personal biases. While observational research has its limitations, it remains a powerful tool for studying behavior, whether in natural settings or structured environments. The key is to balance the realism of natural observation with the control and reliability of structured research methods to gain the most meaningful insights. One of the most common tools psychologists use to gather data is the survey. Surveys consist of lists of questions that participants answer, and they can be delivered in various ways, through paper and pencil questionnaires, electronic forms, or verbal interviews. One of the biggest advantages of surveys is their efficiency. They can be completed quickly, and they allow researchers to collect data from a large number of people in a relatively short amount of time. Surveys help researchers gather information from a sample, which is a smaller group selected from a larger population, the group that researchers are ultimately interested in studying. By analyzing data from the sample, researchers aim to generalize their findings to the broader population. However, to make meaningful conclusions, they need a way to summarize and interpret the data they collect. A key step in this process is calculating measures of central tendency, which help determine what a typical response looks like in a given data set. There are three main measures of central tendency: mode, the most frequently occurring response in the dataset; median, the middle value when all responses are arranged in order; mean, the arithmetic average of all responses, calculated by adding all values and dividing by the total number of responses. The mean is particularly useful for further statistical analysis, but it comes with a drawback. It is highly sensitive to outliers. An outlier is a data point that is much higher or lower than the others, which can skew the mean and make it less representative of the overall dataset. For this reason, researchers must be careful when interpreting central tendency measures, ensuring that they accurately reflect the data. Surveys are powerful because they provide broad, generalizable insights about human behavior. But like all research methods, they have limitations. The way data is analyzed and interpreted plays a critical role in ensuring that the findings are both accurate and meaningful. Surveys offer both advantages and limitations when compared to case studies. One of their greatest strengths is the ability to collect information from a larger group of people, which makes it easier to capture the diversity of a population. A sufficiently large and diverse sample allows researchers to generalize findings with greater confidence than they could from a case study, which focuses on a small number of individuals. However, this broad scope comes at a cost. Because surveys involve many participants, researchers are unable to gather the same level of depth and detail about each person that they would obtain in a case study. Another limitation of surveys is that participants do not always provide completely accurate responses. People may misremember details, exaggerate, or respond in ways that they believe will make them look better. For example, when asked about their alcohol consumption, some individuals might report drinking less than they actually do in order to appear more responsible. These inaccuracies can introduce bias into survey results, making it difficult to determine the true nature of people's behaviors or attitudes. Despite these challenges, surveys remain a valuable tool for answering a wide range of research questions. One real-world example of survey research comes from a study conducted by Jenkins and colleagues, which examined attitudes toward the Arab American community following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The researchers wanted to assess whether negative attitudes toward Arab Americans persisted nearly a decade after the attacks. To do this, they asked 140 participants to complete a survey that included 10 questions. Some questions directly asked about participants' prejudicial attitudes toward different ethnic groups, while others took a more indirect approach, asking how likely participants would be to engage in social interactions with individuals of various backgrounds. The results revealed an interesting pattern. Participants were unwilling to admit to holding prejudiced attitudes toward any ethnic group. Yet their responses to questions about social interaction suggested otherwise. When asked whether they would introduce themselves to someone of Arab American descent, participants expressed lower levels of willingness compared to other ethnic groups. This indicated that, despite their claims of being unbiased, some participants still harbored subtle forms of prejudice. Studies like this highlight both the strengths and challenges of survey research. While surveys can reveal meaningful trends across a broad population, they also depend on self-reported data, which can sometimes mask underlying attitudes or behaviors. Some researchers gather vast amounts of data without ever interacting with a single participant. Instead, they analyze existing records to uncover patterns and relationships in what is known as archival research. This approach relies on previously collected data, allowing researchers to answer important questions without the need for direct observation or experimentation. For example, a researcher might examine academic records from the past decade to investigate how long students take to complete their degrees. By analyzing course loads, grades, and extracurricular activities, they could identify trends in student success and pinpoint potential risk factors that contribute to academic struggles. Archival research provides valuable insights into real-world behaviors and outcomes by leveraging information that has already been collected. This method differs significantly from other research approaches in several ways. One major advantage is that it saves time and resources, since researchers do not have to recruit participants or gather new data. Instead, they work with existing datasets, making the process far more cost-effective than conducting a large-scale study from scratch. However, this also introduces limitations. Since researchers have no control over what data was originally collected, they must tailor their research questions to fit the structure of the available records. Additionally, differences in how data was recorded across various sources can make it difficult to compare results, leading to potential inconsistencies. Despite these challenges, archival research remains a powerful tool for analyzing long-term trends and drawing conclusions from real-world data. By working with existing records, researchers can explore patterns that would be difficult or impossible to study through direct observation alone. When studying how people change over time, researchers often use longitudinal research, which involves collecting data from the same group of individuals at multiple points over an extended period. For example, a study on dietary habits might survey participants at age 20, follow up with them again at 30, and then collect data once more at 40. This approach allows researchers to track individual changes and patterns over time, making it particularly valuable in studies of human development and lifespan. Another approach is cross-sectional research, in which researchers compare different groups of people at a single point in time. Instead of following the same individuals for decades, a researcher studying dietary habits might compare a group of 20-year-olds to a group of 30-year-olds and another group of 40-year-olds. This method is more efficient because it requires a shorter time commitment. However, it comes with a limitation known as the cohort effect. Differences observed between age groups may not be due to aging itself, but rather to the distinct social and cultural experiences that shaped each generation. To illustrate this, consider the issue of public opinion on same-sex marriage. Research has shown that younger individuals tend to be more supportive of same-sex marriage than older individuals. A cross-sectional study might conclude that people become less supportive as they age. However, another explanation could be that older generations grew up in different social climates that shaped their perspectives. A longitudinal study following the same individuals over time would help clarify whether attitudes truly shift with age or whether they are influenced more by generational differences. Longitudinal research offers a significant advantage because it reduces concerns about cohort effects. Since the same individuals participate throughout the study, researchers can more confidently attribute changes to aging rather than to generational influences. However, longitudinal studies require a much greater investment of time and resources, and participant dropout over time can pose challenges to maintaining a consistent sample. Despite these difficulties, longitudinal research remains a powerful tool for understanding how behaviors, attitudes, and characteristics evolve over the lifespan. Longitudinal studies are a valuable tool in medical research, particularly in understanding the risk factors associated with diseases. These studies often follow tens of thousands of individuals over several decades, allowing researchers to track patterns and identify long-term health trends. Because of the large sample sizes involved, findings from longitudinal research can be confidently generalized to the broader population, making them highly influential in shaping public health policies and medical guidelines. One prominent example is the Cancer Prevention Study, 3 or CPS-3, a long-term research project conducted by the American Cancer Society. This study aims to identify predictive risk factors for cancer by tracking participants over a 20-year period. When individuals enter the study, they provide detailed information about their lifestyle and family medical history. Every few years, they receive follow-up surveys, allowing researchers to monitor any changes in their health and lifestyle. Over time, scientists will analyze which participants develop cancer and which do not, helping to uncover potential risk factors and protective factors for the disease. Longitudinal research of this kind has already led to significant medical breakthroughs. Earlier studies conducted by the American Cancer Society were among the first to provide scientific evidence linking smoking to increased cancer risk. These findings played a crucial role in establishing smoking as a major public health concern and influenced policies aimed at reducing tobacco use. By following large populations over extended periods, longitudinal studies continue to provide essential insights into disease prevention and long-term health outcomes. While longitudinal research provides valuable insights, it also comes with significant challenges. One of the biggest limitations is the time investment required from both researchers and participants. Since these studies often span years or even decades, the results are not immediately available, which can slow down the application of findings to real-world issues. In addition to the time commitment, longitudinal research demands substantial financial resources, making it difficult for many researchers to sustain these projects from start to finish. Another major challenge is maintaining participant engagement over long periods. People's lives change, they move to new locations, change names, experience health issues, or simply decide to stop participating. This contributes to attrition, the gradual loss of participants over time, which is a common issue in longitudinal research. High attrition rates can reduce the reliability of a study's findings, as the remaining participants may no longer represent the broader population. To mitigate this issue, researchers typically begin with large sample sizes, anticipating that some individuals will drop out. Throughout the study, they continuously monitor whether the sample still reflects the larger population and make adjustments when necessary. Despite these challenges, longitudinal research remains an essential tool for understanding long-term trends and risk factors. While time-consuming and resource-intensive, it offers unique insights that cannot be captured through shorter-term studies, making it a valuable method for tracking changes in health, behavior, and development over time. Did you know that as ice cream sales increase, crime rates also rise? Does this mean that eating ice cream somehow leads people to commit crimes? Or perhaps after committing a crime, someone decides to celebrate with a cone? While the data does show a relationship between ice cream sales and crime rates, it would be a mistake to assume that one causes the other. A more logical explanation is that both trends are influenced by a third factor: temperature. When the weather is warm, more people spend time outdoors, increasing the chances of social interactions, which sometimes lead to conflict and crime. At the same time, warm weather also drives people to cool down with ice cream. This is a classic example of correlation without causation. Just because two variables appear to be related does not mean that one is causing the other. Understanding how to identify relationships between variables and determining whether those relationships are meaningful or just coincidences is a crucial part of psychological research. It allows researchers to separate true cause and effect relationships from situations where external factors might be influencing the results. This distinction is essential for making accurate conclusions and avoiding misleading assumptions. Correlation refers to the relationship between two or more variables, but it does not necessarily indicate cause and effect. When two variables are correlated, it simply means that as one changes, the other tends to change as well. However, this relationship does not imply that one variable is directly causing the other to change. To measure the strength and direction of a correlation, researchers calculate a statistic called the correlation coefficient, represented by the letter R. This number falls between -1 and +1, where the absolute value of the number indicates the strength of the relationship. The closer the correlation coefficient is to 1 or -1, the stronger and more predictable the relationship between the variables. For example, a correlation of 0.9 suggests a much stronger relationship than a correlation of 0.3. If there is no relationship between the variables, the correlation coefficient is 0.0. The sign of the correlation coefficient, whether it is positive or negative, reveals the direction of the relationship. A positive correlation means that both variables move in the same direction. As one increases, the other increases as well. As one decreases, so does the other. For example, a positive correlation might exist between study time and test scores. Students who study more tend to score higher. In contrast, a negative correlation means the variables move in opposite directions. As one variable increases, the other decreases. An example of a negative correlation might be the relationship between stress levels and sleep. People who experience higher stress tend to get less sleep. Returning to the earlier example of ice cream sales and crime, one might initially assume there is no relationship between these variables. However, a correlation does exist. Both increase at the same time. This does not mean that eating ice cream causes crime, or that committing a crime leads to ice cream consumption. Instead, an external factor, warm weather, influences both trends. This highlights the importance of carefully interpreting correlations, as they do not always indicate direct causation. The relationship between ice cream sales and crime rates is an example of a positive correlation because both variables increase as temperatures rise. However, this does not mean that one causes the other. Rather, a third factor, warm weather, influences both trends. Other examples of positive correlation include the relationship between a person's height and weight, or between age and the number of wrinkles. In both cases, as one variable increases, so does the other. A negative correlation, on the other hand, occurs when one variable increases while the other decreases. A simple example would be the relationship between hours of sleep and daytime tiredness. As sleep decreases, tiredness increases. A real-world example of this comes from research conducted at the University of Minnesota, where student researchers found a weak negative correlation, R equals negative 0.29, between the number of days students got fewer than 5 hours of sleep per week and their GPA. While the correlation was not particularly strong, it suggested that students who regularly slept less tended to have slightly lower academic performance. It is important to note that a negative correlation is not the same as no correlation. For instance, we would likely find no relationship between hours of sleep and shoe size, as these two variables are unrelated. Correlations also have predictive value, which is useful in many real-world applications. Consider a college admissions committee reviewing a large pool of applicants, but only able to admit a limited number of students. One way to make decisions would be to examine the correlation between current students' GPA and their scores on standardized tests. If a strong correlation exists, the admissions committee could use these test scores to predict which applicants are more likely to succeed academically at the university. This illustrates how correlations, while not proving causation, can help inform decision-making by identifying patterns that suggest probable outcomes based on past data. Correlational research is a valuable tool for identifying the strength and direction of relationships between two variables. However, while correlation can reveal meaningful connections, it does not establish causation. Just because two variables move together does not mean that one is directly causing the other to change. Sometimes, an external factor, known as a confounding variable, is responsible for the relationship. In the ice cream and crime rate example, the real driving force behind both trends is temperature. As temperatures rise, more people go outside, increasing the likelihood of social interactions, which can sometimes lead to crime. At the same time, warm weather also makes people more likely to buy ice cream. In this case, temperature is the confounding variable that influences both ice cream sales and crime rates, creating a correlation between the two despite there being no direct connection. Even when an obvious confounding variable cannot be identified, researchers must be careful not to assume that correlation implies cause and effect. This can be frustrating when the relationship between two variables seems intuitive. Consider the research conducted by the American Cancer Society on smoking and cancer. The strong correlation between smoking and cancer suggests a causal relationship. But if researchers were relying only on correlational studies, they would be unable to definitively claim that smoking causes cancer. Without experimental research, the possibility of other contributing factors, such as genetics or environmental exposures, cannot be ruled out. Despite this limitation, claims of causation based on correlation appear frequently in advertising and media. Companies and marketers often take advantage of correlational findings to make bold but misleading claims. For example, studies have found that people who eat certain types of breakfast cereal have a lower risk of heart disease. A cereal company might highlight this research in its marketing, leading consumers to believe that eating cereal directly improves heart health. However, there could be many alternative explanations for this relationship. People who eat cereal regularly might also be more likely to maintain a healthier diet overall, engage in more physical activity, or have other lifestyle habits that reduce the risk of heart disease. Because correlational research cannot establish causation, psychologists and scientists rely on experimental research to answer questions about cause and effect. Unlike correlation studies, experiments use controlled methods to eliminate alternative explanations, allowing researchers to determine how changes in one variable directly influence another. The next section will explore how experiments are designed to isolate causal relationships and provide clear, scientifically valid conclusions about human behavior and other phenomena. Misinterpreting data is not limited to making false cause and effect conclusions from correlational research. Another common mistake is illusory correlation, where people perceive a relationship between two things even when no such connection exists. These false correlations often emerge from unsystematic observations, where patterns appear to exist simply because people expect them to. One well-known example is the belief that the phases of the moon affect human behavior, particularly the idea that people act strangely during a full moon. Many individuals, including medical professionals and law enforcement officers, claim to notice an increase in odd or erratic behavior during this time. The logic behind this belief often stems from the fact that the moon exerts a gravitational pull on Earth's tides, leading people to assume that, since the human body is made mostly of water, the moon must influence us as well. However, a meta-analysis of nearly 40 studies found no scientific evidence to support this claim. In reality, unusual behavior occurs at a constant rate throughout the lunar cycle, but people are more likely to notice and remember strange incidents when they happen under a full moon, reinforcing the illusion of a connection. Why do people believe in illusory correlations? One major factor is confirmation bias, the tendency to focus on information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring evidence that contradicts them. If someone expects a full moon to bring about unusual behavior, they are more likely to notice and remember instances that confirm this belief, while overlooking similar behavior that happens at other times. Additionally, illusory correlations often arise because we rely on the most easily recalled information, even if it is limited or misleading. While illusory correlations might seem harmless, they can have serious consequences, particularly in shaping prejudicial attitudes. People may falsely associate certain behaviors with specific groups of individuals, reinforcing stereotypes that lead to discrimination. When inaccurate patterns become widely accepted, they can influence decision-making, social interactions, and even policies, often with negative effects. Recognizing and questioning illusory correlations is essential to developing critical thinking skills and ensuring that our understanding of the world is based on evidence rather than assumption. To establish a cause and effect relationship between two variables, researchers must conduct a scientific experiment. The term experiment has a specific meaning in science that differs from how it is used in everyday conversation. In casual speech, Experimenting might refer to trying something new, like a different hairstyle or a new type of food. However, in the scientific context, an experiment follows precise methodological guidelines to ensure reliable and valid results. A scientific experiment begins with a specific hypothesis that can be tested. Hypotheses can be developed in different ways, either through direct observation of the real world or after carefully reviewing previous research. Suppose you suspect that technology use in the classroom negatively impacts learning. This assumption forms the basis of a hypothesis. Limiting technology use in the classroom improves student learning outcomes. But how did you arrive at this hypothesis? Perhaps you notice that classmates who take notes on their laptops tend to perform worse on exams compared to those who take notes by hand. Or maybe you observed that students who learn from a computer program achieve different test scores than those taught by an in-person instructor. While personal observations can be useful in forming hypotheses, they are not enough to establish cause and effect. Anecdotal evidence, what we personally notice in our everyday lives, can be misleading because it is limited and subjective. A single observation does not account for all the variables that might influence an outcome. To determine whether a hypothesis holds true beyond individual experiences, researchers must systematically test it using controlled experiments. Experiments allow scientists to collect real-world data under carefully designed conditions, ensuring that alternative explanations are ruled out. By applying the scientific method, researchers can move beyond assumptions and provide credible evidence to support or refute a hypothesis. This process is essential for building reliable knowledge in psychology and other fields of research. The most basic experimental design consists of two groups, the experimental group and the control group. These groups are designed to be as similar as possible, except for one key difference: the experimental manipulation. The experimental group receives the treatment or variable being tested, while the control group does not. By ensuring that this one difference is the only variable separating the two groups, researchers can confidently determine whether the experimental manipulation is responsible for any observed differences in outcomes. To apply this concept to our earlier example, suppose we want to test the hypothesis that limiting technology in the classroom improves learning outcomes. We would divide participants into two groups. The experimental group would learn algebra using a computer-based program, while the control group would receive instruction from a traditional classroom teacher. Afterward, both groups would be assessed to determine how much they learned. It is essential that the control group experiences conditions that are as similar as possible to those of the experimental group, apart from the use of technology. This ensures that any differences in learning outcomes are due to the experimental manipulation and not other unrelated factors. To conduct a well-designed experiment, researchers must also precisely define the variables they are measuring. This is done through an operational definition, which clearly outlines how a variable will be measured. In this study, we need to define exactly what we mean by learning algebra. One way to operationalize learning might be to measure performance on a standardized algebra test given after the lesson. Alternatively, researchers could ask participants to summarize the key concepts they were taught to evaluate their comprehension. Defining variables in a clear, specific, and measurable way allows others to interpret the results accurately and replicate the study if needed. By using experimental and control groups and establishing operational definitions, researchers create reliable and valid experiments that can produce meaningful conclusions. This level of precision ensures that results are not only interpretable but also replicable, which is a cornerstone of scientific research. Once we have clearly defined what we consider technology, use, and learning in our experiment, we must determine how the study will be conducted. In this case, participants would spend 45 minutes learning algebra, either through a computer program or with an in-person math teacher. Afterward, they would take a test to assess how much they learned from the lesson. To ensure that the results are as objective as possible, it is crucial to control for experimenter bias, which occurs when a researcher's expectations influence the interpretation of results. Researchers invest significant time and effort into their studies, and they may unintentionally favor findings that support their hypothesis. For example, if the individuals grading the tests know which students were in the experimental group and which were in the control group, they might unconsciously evaluate responses differently. Sloppy handwriting, minor errors, or ambiguous answers could be judged more leniently or more harshly depending on the grader's expectations. To prevent this from happening, test scorers should be blind to group assignments, meaning they do not know which students were taught by a computer program and which were taught by a teacher. This setup is known as a single blind study, where participants do not know whether they are in the experimental or control group, but the researcher does. However, to further eliminate potential bias, researchers sometimes use a double-blind study, where neither the participants nor the researchers know which group each participant is in. This prevents both experimenter bias and participant expectations from influencing the results. A key reason for using a double-blind design is to control for the placebo effect, which occurs when people's expectations shape their experiences, even if no actual change has taken place. If participants believe that a particular learning method will help them perform better, their confidence alone might improve their test scores. By keeping both researchers and participants unaware of group assignments, double-blind studies ensure that any observed effects are due to the experimental manipulation itself, rather than expectations or biases. This level of control helps maintain the integrity and accuracy of scientific experiments. The placebo effect is often discussed in the context of medical research, particularly when testing the effectiveness of new medications. Imagine working for a pharmaceutical company that has developed a new drug intended to treat depression. To determine whether the medication is truly effective, you conduct an experiment with two groups: an experimental group that receives the actual drug and a control group that does not. However, it is important that participants do not know whether they received the real medication or not. Why is this necessary? Consider how expectations influence experience. If you were a participant in this study and took a pill that you believed would improve your mood, you might start to feel better simply because you expect the pill to work, even if the pill contains no active ingredients. This phenomenon is known as the placebo effect, where a person experiences a real change in their condition due to their expectations rather than the actual treatment. To control for this effect, researchers give the control group a placebo, which in this case would be a sugar pill that has no medicinal properties. This way, both groups receive a pill, ensuring that any psychological benefits are not merely due to the act of taking a pill itself. Additionally, to eliminate experimenter bias and participant expectations, the study would be conducted as a double-blind experiment, where neither the participants nor the researchers know who has received the real drug and who has received the placebo. By designing the study this way, researchers can confidently attribute any differences in mood improvement between the two groups to the actual effects of the medication rather than the power of suggestion or unconscious biases. This method allows for scientifically valid conclusions about the drug's effectiveness, ensuring that any improvements in mood are caused by the medication itself rather than psychological factors. In an experiment, the goal is to determine whether changes in one factor cause changes in another. To do this, researchers focus on two key variables: the independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is the factor that the experimenter manipulates or controls. In a well-designed study, this should be the only difference between the experimental and control groups. In our earlier example of technology use in the classroom, the independent variable is the method of instruction, whether participants learn algebra through a computer program or from an in-person teacher. The dependent variable is the outcome being measured, the factor that is expected to change in response to the independent variable. In this case, the dependent variable is learning performance, which researchers can assess through test scores or other measures of comprehension. The dependent variable is called dependent because it depends on the independent variable. A simple way to frame the relationship between these two variables is by asking, what effect does the independent variable have on the dependent variable? In this study, the question becomes, how does the method of instruction, independent variable, affect student learning, dependent variable, if students in the computer-based learning group perform significantly better or worse than those in the teacher-led group? Researchers can conclude that the method of instruction had an impact on learning outcomes. By carefully manipulating the independent variable while keeping all other factors constant, experiments allow researchers to establish cause and effect relationships, providing reliable insights into how one factor influences another. Now that we have designed our study, the next step is to select participants who will take part in the experiment. Since our study involves human participants, we must carefully determine who to include to ensure that our results are meaningful and applicable to a broader population. In psychological research, participants are the subjects of the study and actively engage in the research process. Historically, many psychological experiments have relied heavily on college students as participants, largely because they are readily available on university campuses. While this practice is common, it raises an important concern. Are college students truly representative of the general population? College students tend to be younger, more educated, more liberal, and less diverse than society as a whole. This means that findings based primarily on college student samples may not be easily generalized to people outside that demographic. In our hypothetical experiment, we are studying high school students learning algebra, so our population of interest is all algebra students. However, this population is too large to include every student in our study, so we must select a sample, a smaller group of students who will represent the larger population. One of the best ways to do this is through a random sample, where every individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected. A random sample ensures that the characteristics of our participants, such as gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and other relevant factors are similar to those found in the broader population. To make our study manageable, we might narrow our focus to algebra students in a particular city. Even within this smaller group, we must ensure that our sample includes students from diverse backgrounds, including different income levels, family structures, racial and ethnic groups, and geographic areas. By working with local schools, we could randomly select around 200 students to participate in the experiment. If our sample is truly representative, we can be more confident that our results apply to the larger population rather than just the individuals we studied. By carefully selecting participants and using random sampling, researchers increase the reliability and generalizability of their findings, ensuring that their study provides valuable insights that extend beyond the immediate group of participants. Since testing every algebra student in a city is impractical, we select a representative sample of about 200 students who reflect the city's diverse composition. A well-selected sample allows us to generalize our findings to the larger population without worrying about bias. Once we have our sample, the next step is to divide participants into two groups, an experimental group and a control group. This is done through a process called random assignment, where each participant has an equal chance of being placed in either group. Random assignment is essential for ensuring that the groups are comparable before the experiment begins. Researchers use statistical software to randomly assign participants, ensuring that systematic differences do not emerge between the two groups. If random assignment is done properly and the sample is large enough, it becomes highly unlikely that one group will be made up entirely of students of a single gender, ethnicity, or background. This step is critical because if there were pre-existing differences between groups, it would be impossible to determine the true cause of any observed differences in learning outcomes. For example, if one group started off with significantly stronger math skills than the other, we wouldn't be able to tell whether our experimental manipulation, the method of instruction, caused any observed differences in performance, or whether those differences were already present before the study began. By ensuring that both groups start off statistically equivalent, random assignment allows researchers to isolate the effects of the independent variable. This means that any differences in learning outcomes between the experimental and control groups can be confidently attributed to the method of instruction, rather than to other pre-existing factors. This level of control is what makes experiments one of the most powerful tools for establishing cause and effect relationships in research. While experiments allow researchers to establish cause and effect relationships, they are not without limitations. One major challenge is that true experiments require the manipulation of an independent variable, which is not always possible. Some research questions involve variables that cannot be directly controlled by an experimenter. For example, suppose a researcher wants to examine the effect of biological sex, the independent variable, on spatial memory, the dependent variable. While they can certainly compare differences between males and females on a spatial memory task, they cannot randomly assign participants to be male or female. Since sex is a pre-existing characteristic, it is not something that can be manipulated within an experiment. Instead, research in these situations is classified as quasi-experimental rather than a true experiment. The key distinction is that quasi-experiments lack random assignment, which means they do not allow for definitive cause and effect conclusions. Ethical constraints also limit the types of experiments researchers can conduct. Some questions cannot be explored through direct experimental manipulation because doing so would cause harm. Consider a study aimed at determining whether childhood abuse leads to lower self-esteem in adulthood. To conduct a true experiment, researchers would need to randomly assign some children to experience abuse and others to be raised in non-abusive environments, something that would be highly unethical. Because of these limitations, psychologists often rely on alternative research methods such as correlational studies, longitudinal research, and case studies to examine sensitive topics. While these methods do not establish causation in the way that experiments can, they still provide valuable insights into human behavior and psychological development. Ethics and feasibility must always be considered when designing studies, ensuring that research is conducted responsibly while still advancing scientific understanding. Once data is collected from both the experimental and control groups, researchers conduct a statistical analysis to determine whether any observed differences between the groups are meaningful or simply due to chance. Statistical analysis helps researchers assess the likelihood that the results are random fluctuations rather than actual effects of the independent variable. For example, imagine an experiment testing the effectiveness of a nutritional supplement. If both the experimental group, those who took the supplement, and the control group, those who took a placebo, show similar results, the experiment would suggest that the supplement is not effective. Researchers set a threshold for statistical significance to determine whether their findings are reliable. In psychology, a result is typically considered statistically significant if there is less than a 5% chance that the observed difference is due to random variation. In other words, psychologists aim to limit the risk of making false positive claims, incorrectly concluding that an effect exists when it does not, to 5% or less. The greatest strength of experimental research is that it allows researchers to confidently assert causation. By using random selection, random assignment, and a carefully controlled design that minimizes bias, researchers can ensure that the only meaningful difference between groups is the independent variable. This means that any observed effect on the dependent variable can be attributed to the experimental manipulation. For instance, if an experiment finds that watching a violent television program leads to more aggressive behavior compared to watching a nonviolent program, researchers can conclude with confidence that exposure to violent television causes an increase in violent behavior. This ability to establish cause and effect relationships is what makes experimental research one of the most powerful tools in psychology. When psychologists complete a research project, they aim to share their findings with other scientists. To ensure consistency and clarity, the American Psychological Association, APA, provides detailed guidelines on how to write research papers for submission to scientific journals. Unlike popular psychology articles that appear in magazines like Psychology Today, which target general audiences, scientific journal articles are written for professionals and scholars engaged in research. These articles undergo a rigorous peer review process, which ensures that only high-quality, well-supported research is published. A peer-reviewed journal article is evaluated by several experts in the field, who remain anonymous to the author. These peer reviewers assess the paper's quality, checking whether the research has a strong rationale, a clear methodology, and ethical integrity. They also scrutinize the study's design, methods, and statistical analyses, ensuring that the conclusions drawn align with the data presented. Additionally, they consider whether the research makes a meaningful contribution to the field and prevents unnecessary duplication of existing studies. After reviewing the manuscript, the journal editor compiles feedback from the reviewers and makes a decision. In most cases, research articles are not immediately accepted for publication. Instead, authors are typically asked to make revisions based on the reviewer's suggestions. In some cases, if the study has serious flaws, it may be rejected altogether. The peer review process serves as an essential quality control mechanism, helping to filter out poorly designed studies while improving strong research through constructive feedback. Peer review also ensures that research is described in enough detail to allow for replication. Replication is critical because it allows other scientists to repeat the study with different participants or under slightly different conditions to determine whether the findings are reliable. Sometimes, replications include additional measures that expand upon the original study. When a study's results are successfully replicated multiple times, scientists become more confident in the findings. On the other hand, if replications repeatedly fail, the legitimacy of the original study comes into question, leading researchers to re-evaluate its claims. For instance, consider a hypothetical medical breakthrough where a study claims that a new drug significantly improves health without requiring any lifestyle changes. If other researchers attempt to replicate the study's results but fail to produce the same outcome, confidence in the original findings would decline. Without successful replications, the scientific community would be skeptical of the drug's effectiveness, highlighting the importance of peer review and replication in maintaining the integrity of psychological and medical research. In recent years, concerns over a replication crisis have emerged across multiple scientific disciplines, including psychology. Replication is essential for scientific credibility, yet many well-known studies have failed to be replicated, calling into question their findings. Some of the most influential research and prominent scientists have faced challenges in reproducing their own or others' results, highlighting the fragility of certain scientific claims. The issue gained further attention when even a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, Frances Arnold, publicly retracted a published paper after being unable to replicate her own findings. High-profile cases like this underscore the reality that scientific research, even when conducted by respected experts, is not immune to error or limitations. While some view this replication crisis as a troubling sign for psychology and other fields, others argue that it is leading to positive changes in scientific practices. Increased scrutiny has encouraged greater transparency and collaboration among researchers. Many scientists are now embracing open science practices, which involve sharing data, pre-registering studies, and encouraging independent replications before major conclusions are accepted. In this way, what has been labeled a crisis may ultimately strengthen scientific research by improving its rigor, accountability, and reliability. Reliability and validity are two essential factors in data collection, ensuring that research findings are both consistent and accurate. Reliability refers to the ability to produce the same result repeatedly under the same conditions. In psychological research, this means that any tools, tests, or observational methods used to collect data must yield consistent and reproducible outcomes. Several types of reliability are considered when evaluating research instruments. Inter-rater reliability assesses the degree to which multiple observers agree on what they have observed. Internal consistency examines whether different survey items measuring the same concept correlate with one another. Test-retest reliability evaluates whether a measure produces similar results when used on the same subjects at different points in time. However, reliability alone is not enough. Just because an instrument consistently measures something does not mean that it is measuring it correctly. A kitchen scale, for instance, might consistently give the same weight for a portion of cereal each morning. But if it is miscalibrated, the weight is incorrect every time. In this case, the scale is reliable but not valid because it does not accurately measure the intended quantity. Validity refers to how well a tool measures what it is supposed to measure. There are different types of validity that researchers take into account. Ecological validity examines whether research findings apply to real-world settings. Construct validity assesses whether a variable truly captures the concept it is meant to measure. Face validity considers whether a test appears to measure what it claims to at first glance. A key principle in research is that while a valid instrument is always reliable, the reverse is not necessarily true. A measurement can be highly reliable, yet completely invalid if it consistently measures the wrong thing. This is why researchers strive to use tools and methods that are both reliable and valid, ensuring that their findings are not only consistent, but also meaningful and accurate. Today, scientists agree that ethical research is fundamental to maintaining respect for human dignity and safety. However, as history has shown, ethical standards have not always been upheld. Modern researchers must demonstrate that their work meets strict ethical guidelines, ensuring that participants are protected from harm. This section explores how ethics influence research, design, and implementation, and the measures in place to safeguard human participants. Any experiment involving human subjects is subject to extensive ethical regulations. Research institutions that receive federal funding must have an Institutional Review Board, IRB, a committee responsible for reviewing research proposals to ensure that studies comply with ethical principles. IRBs typically include administrators, scientists, and community members, all of whom review research protocols to determine whether they adequately protect participants. Approval from the IRB is generally required before an experiment can proceed. One of the most critical ethical requirements is informed consent. Before participating in a study, individuals must sign an informed consent form, which provides a clear written description of what they can expect. This document outlines the potential risks and implications of the research, assures participants that their involvement is voluntary, and states that they may withdraw at any time without penalty. Additionally, the form guarantees that any data collected will remain confidential. For participants under 18, a parent or legal guardian must provide consent on their behalf. While informed consent should be as transparent as possible, there are cases where deception is necessary to maintain the integrity of the experiment. Deception occurs when participants are intentionally misled to prevent their awareness of the research question from influencing their behavior. However, deception must never be harmful or excessive. For example, If a study examines how people's perceptions of others are influenced by attire, participants might not be told the true purpose of the study beforehand, as this knowledge could alter their responses. In any study involving deception, debriefing is required at the conclusion of the experiment. During debriefing, participants receive a full explanation of the research, including its purpose, how data will be used, and why deception was necessary. Researchers must also provide contact information so participants can seek additional details about the study. These ethical safeguards ensure that research upholds scientific integrity while respecting and protecting participants' rights and well-being. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972, remains one of the most egregious violations of research ethics in history. In this study, 600 rural black men from Tuskegee were recruited under the false pretense of receiving free medical care, meals, and burial insurance. The actual purpose of the study was to observe the long-term effects of untreated syphilis in black men. Among the participants, 399 men tested positive for syphilis and served as the experimental group, while 201 syphilis-free men were used as a control group. However, those who tested positive for syphilis were never informed of their diagnosis, depriving them of the ability to make informed decisions about their health. When the study began, there was no cure for syphilis, but by 1947, penicillin was widely recognized as an effective treatment. Despite this, the researchers intentionally withheld treatment from the infected participants. Furthermore, the men were not allowed to seek treatment elsewhere, meaning their condition was deliberately left untreated for decades. As a result, many of them unknowingly spread the disease to their wives, leading to congenital syphilis in their children. Over the course of 40 years, numerous participants suffered severe health complications, spread the disease to their families, and eventually died, all because they were denied access to life-saving treatment. The study was finally discontinued in 1972, after it was exposed by the national press, sparking widespread public outrage. This scandal directly led to the creation of the National Research Act of 1974, which established the strict ethical guidelines that govern research involving human participants today. This study was deeply unethical on multiple levels. First, the men were not informed of their true diagnosis, preventing them from making autonomous choices about their medical care. Second, they were denied treatment even after a cure became available, leading to avoidable suffering and death. Third, the researchers' actions directly harmed not only the participants, but also their families, as the disease was unintentionally transmitted to spouses and children. This case serves as a dark reminder of what can happen when research is conducted without ethical oversight. It underscores the importance of informed consent, transparency, and respect for human dignity in all scientific studies. The Tuskegee study's ethical failures led to sweeping reforms, ensuring that modern research prioritizes the well-being of participants and adheres to the highest ethical standards. Many psychologists conduct research using animal subjects, particularly rodents and birds, which account for approximately 90% of animal research in psychology. These species are commonly used because many basic biological and behavioral processes in animals are similar to those in humans, making them useful substitutes for research that would be considered unethical in human participants. However, conducting research with animals does not exempt scientists from ethical responsibilities. The humane and ethical treatment of animal subjects is a fundamental requirement, and researchers must design their studies in ways that minimize pain, distress, and discomfort. For research involving human participants, an institutional review board, IRB, oversees ethical compliance. Similarly, for animal research, proposals must be reviewed by an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACUC. The IACUC is responsible for evaluating research proposals to ensure that all animal studies adhere to strict ethical guidelines. This committee is composed of institutional administrators, scientists, veterinarians, and community members, ensuring that research is conducted with scientific integrity while prioritizing the well-being of animal subjects. Beyond reviewing research proposals, the IACUC also conducts semi-annual inspections of all animal research facilities to verify that protocols are being strictly followed. No study involving animal subjects can proceed without IACUC approval, and researchers must demonstrate that their experiments are necessary, scientifically valid, and designed to minimize harm. This oversight ensures that psychological research involving animals remains both ethical and scientifically justified, reinforcing the importance of responsible research practices in the field.